Okay, welcome everybody. We're talking about nuts today. We're going to try to avoid as many puns as humanly possible in the time we're together. Um, but I wanted to talk about nuts for this episode of the Dan and Doug show. First of all, let's welcome Dan Earlywine and Jamie Roadman, who's going to be joining us today as well. And I wanted to talk about nuts because it's probably one of the most common bread and butter jobs all of us do. Um, beyond the usual setup and maintenance stuff. In part, I think because at least in most of my career, manufacturers, at least large manufacturers of guitars, have done a wonderfully horrible job at making nuts for their instruments. They either come made of pretty poor materials, or the spacing is not what you would want to see on a particular guitar, or every time you change strings, the spacing doesn't seem to work out. So we've all had this need for doing nut work as part of our day-to-day type of job, and it's very much considered a bread and butter job of what we do. I, to tell the honest truth, when we first started talking about doing these, I wanted to take a different subject matter every time we did an episode and dive as deeply as we could into it. Not necessarily from the standpoint of showing how things should be done, but showing how things are, at least how I do them, how Dan does them, and whoever else we choose to have on with us. Just different ways of doing it, different ways that we deal with whatever the subject matter is. And as I had said today, we're talking about nuts. I've said it before as we start these off that there is no right way to do whatever we're doing. There's a wrong way to do it, and that's usually to, end up with a poorly fitted, poorly spaced nut. Beyond that, how you get there is just a matter of how you want to do it. So we're going to go through a series of ways of how each of us deal with those different things, some of the tools we use, and so forth and so such. Since we're starting a little bit later, I think I'm going to skip the part of nut removal, because I think we all know how to get a nut out of a guitar. I was going to show a little bit of that, but I think we should just move right along to the nuts itself. I want to stress that for me, I don't know how anybody else makes nuts. I just know how I've done it and how it has evolved for me over the time that I've been working on guitars. It was something that when I first started, I was very conscious of doing it well. We all kind of pride ourselves in, how good our nut work is, and we see all sorts of very enticing Instagram posts about shiny nuts and all of that good stuff. And I think that's an indication of how seriously we all take what we do and how good a product we want to wind up with. I think the top nut on a guitar is something that's responsible for how well a guitar plays on the neck side of the guitar, more so than a lot of other things on that end of the guitar. Practically almost every customer I've ever had come in with a guitar who's just a guitar player, who comes in and calls me up and swears that they need a new set of tuners, usually has a nut problem and not a tuner problem. So with that, and I think we're going to jump right into looking at the nuts and the nut shelf itself rather than looking at the removal. So for me, once I started getting serious about doing them well, I started getting even more serious about doing them fast and well, because to me, it's one of those areas where I like to get in on the guitar and back to the rest of the job as quickly as possible. because it's a moneymaker. It's one of the things we all do as one of those daily jobs that it could easily take up, an hour, 2, 3 of your life on a given day if all goes sideways. And then of course you're not certainly not into profit when you're getting that deep into a nut. So I started letting my routine of how I make it evolve so that I could make a nut faster and faster and faster. And of course, the faster I become at doing whatever I do behind a guitar for a particular job, the more profitable I can become. And then move on to the next part of the job, getting it, back into the customer's hands quicker. If we want to switch to, for now, if we want to switch to pinning the Dougturnit screen, we can go right to that, and we can kind of move that camera around. So I'm going to go first, and then we're going to bring on Dan to talk about some funky things that he does, and then we're going to see some real machinist stuff when Jamie comes on. So if Ian is still there, if we could pin that Dougturnit camera.
Did you want me to change it to Dougturnit?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. There we go. All right, so we're here at the bench. And I want to quickly run through a couple of things. If I'm looking at a freshly removed nut, this shelf has already been cleaned up, but just for the purposes of discussing it, the first thing you're going to be dealing with is preparing the shelf for a nut. I use, generally speaking, a couple of tools to do that. I don't like files generally. Many of us are familiar with, I don't know what they look like now, but this is my first set of nut files, for dealing with the nut shelf. I've never been enamored with them. I don't think cutting a slot with a file, if I can find the right size one here, here's 3/16, cutting a nut slot with a file this way ever did me any real good. I never had a whole lot of luck with them. It's not that they don't work, they will file a slot, but you're dealing with a very long file against a short cavity, and the geometric aspects of what happens here, just like when I'm dealing with a fingerboard, if I'm moving a long beam over a short space, that's going to cut the ends of my slot faster than the center of my slot, and you'll always wind up with a wobbly slot with a high spot in the center and low spots on the outside. And if you've been frustrated with that while using a long file like this, that's probably the reason why. And it's something that always bothered me, because every time I tried to use this and I tried to pin it as hard as I could and file it back and forth very carefully, I would wind up with a little high spot in the center and then have to take material down in the center, and I wind up chasing my shelf downward deeper than I'd like to. So I don't like files for that purpose. I've gotten away from them very quickly and realized that my best friend for doing this is a chisel, and then a couple of things that are probably not routinely used. So I clean up my fingerboard edge with a chisel right down to where the shelf starts, and I work from one side to the other. When I get to the ends, I chop it this way so I'm not running off the end and knocking lacquer off or binding off at the edge. This is my favorite chisel for doing that. It's been probably cut down over the years, but it was a much longer, probably in somebody else's hands, a much longer, very flat, very thin, probably paring chisel that when you press down on it, bends very easily, and I can get it flat and flush against my nut slot on the fingerboard side without digging into the wood, so I can just get rid of whatever debris and whatever glue is there. Then, to square up my slot, if I can come in here, to square up my slot, I like to use a number of things. My favorite tool for that are machinists' spacers. They're made of steel, they're perfectly sized. If I can find one to match my slot, I've got them in a whole multitude of sizes. If I find one to match my slot, which is somewhere nearby, oh, there it is. I take a machinist's spacer and I cut the end of it. You can see you can probably see the marks on there. I cut the end of it on a belt sander or a round sander, a disc sander, so that it gives me a burr of an edge on the bottom side and on the left side. So that there's my bird down there. When I'm moving across the slot this way, I can keep it flat and it pushes like a snow plow. Right now it's clean, so it's not really taking up much debris, but it'll work its way all the way across the slot, pushing the debris, giving me a pretty square flat spot without having to worry about deepening the slot, without filing into it, and keeping it square. If I have too much material in there, I can go after it with a chisel. I love using these things. They've never failed me. They give me a nice square bottom, and they ride both the fingerboard side and the bottom of the slot at the same time. I use these for other things as well while making nuts, but this is one of my favorite tools for that. When I do have to use a file, I prefer, for the most part, to make my own. These have, this one has a 3/16 and a 1/4 on one side. So if I'm going to go into the 3/16 side, I'll be here and I'll be able to file it down at the bottom of the slot. If I want to take material off, and I can move it back and forth and remove material as I need to, it gives me a nice tall file that I can square up against the bottom of the slot. I have a 1/4 side and I have a 3/16 side. All it is a file glued onto a piece of wood. I have smaller ones for smaller slots, and I can make them pretty quickly for a different size slot if I'm going for it, if I have a different size nut slot that I need to. This is one I like for Martin guitars. Martin guitars have those slanted slots. And by the way, if anybody has any questions, just pop it in the chat, or just better yet, just unmute and shout it out while we're going here. This one here matches two different angles for my Martin slot, and I can just put that in there, rub it up against the fingerboard, and get that cleaned up. This one, sure I'm using the right one. That one there I just keep it up against the fingerboard, and it cleans it up nicely if I want to use that. Usually I'll just use a chisel, because most of the time I'm not super concerned with trying to get this slot perfect in terms of its angle. Martin guitars have had a tendency to have a huge variety of angles, I think, from being worked on over the years, that I don't try to return every slot to the perfect slot. I deal with what's there, and just my biggest concern with almost every slot that I'm dealing with is that it's flat all the way across. Even when I'm dealing with, back to our Les Paul here, even when I'm dealing with what should be a 90-degree angle of being square here. Was there a question in the chat? Oh, Andrew said, when I use a small file, I get a lip right in the corner of the slot. Have to take it out with a chisel. That's common with a flat file. That's true. And by the way, now that Andy brought that up, this is my favorite chisel to deal with that. You know, if you use a mortising chisel, you can not only have a perfectly flat bottom here, a very sharp edge to it, but you can also sharpen the upper shoulder of this, so that if you need to get rid of that small lip in the corner, you can see here how that's taking off. I don't know if you can see into the slot there, but you can see how that's taking off whatever small lip is there in the shoulder right at the corner of that chisel. And that's getting rid of whatever little tiny lip is there, you know, right down in that corner. So thank you for that, Andy. That's what I love to use for that. And I do sharpen both this edge and this edge. I'm not so concerned at this point about the point. I'm not so concerned about the point as much as I am this shoulder up here that's right up against the fingerboard, because by this point I've already flattened out my bottom and I'm not looking to take any more wood off the top. So I leave these two chisels sitting right at where I do nuts. Is that zoomed in? Right at where I do nuts. So I've got my mortising chisel down here. I have my chisel for my paring chisel there. I've got a long 1/8 inch chisel here for fender slots. And I think this is a 3/16 there, which are your most common sizes. So that's the nut shelf. I don't really spend a whole lot of time beyond that getting crazy about the nut shelf. I'm not OCD about making sure this is a perfectly right angle here. I'm not looking for perfect 90 degrees. I prefer to make the nut to the guitar rather than force the guitar to my sense of perfection. If I have a nut that is not perfectly right angled, if I have a nut shelf that's a little bit off this way or that way, I'll make the nut to the shelf rather than make the shelf to the nut and force that in, because then you're spending all sorts of time in here trying to square it up. If it's square already, I'll know it instantaneously by using a machinist square here or a machinist spacer. But that's as far as the nut is concerned, the nut shelf. Now on to making a nut.
Hey, Doug?
Yeah, go ahead, shoot.
In terms of the shelf, if it's like an old guitar or who knows if someone just lathered it in glue and there's a lot like layers of sort of hard, like, do you just approach it the same? That still just scrapes it, or do you soften the glue with something?
Well, then that's why I typically always do this with a chisel. I want to get all of the old glue out.
Of course,
So,
yeah.
this one was, I removed this nut yesterday. I have two identical, or at least somewhat identical Les Pauls here from the custom shop. So I took that nut off yesterday. That one over there, I was going to remove the nut just as an example of how I remove a nut, because I remove them to get them to go up when they come out. I can show that if anybody wants, but I don't know if we have time for that. But so when I'm dealing with this, and in both of these, there was a fair amount of glue in the nut, even out of the custom shop. I don't know why, but so this, I'll clean out all the old glue. If it's an old guitar where somebody's used, lots of adventurous glue to fill up all sorts of tear out and stuff like that, I'll go after it with a chisel. If I have to deepen this slot in order to achieve that, I will. In fact, when we go to look, when I go to work on, instead of, let me move this instead. When I go to, and I'm not making a nut for this now because I've got other work to do the guitar, but when I go to do that, you can see all of the material that's missing in the center from previous nut work, I would guess. All of that's going to be removed. So I will wind up having to deepen this just a hair to get to the center of that. Who wants to see my nut removal? Who is that? Do we want to see?
That was me, Alex Allgood.
Okay.
Get through your time.
Yeah, I'll do it. If anybody wants to do it, I'll do it right now. So let's take a quick look at that. Of course, every time you remove a nut, you don't know what to expect or what you're going to get. The goal, of course, is to have as little debris loss as possible and as clean an extraction as you can get. So I think if I focus in on that, that should do. So my nut removal process is pretty simple. I remove most of them the same way. Fenders are a little different than the Gibson style nut, but most of my acoustic nuts and most of my Martin or Gibson nuts get removed in the same way. Let me just grab this so I can put the guitar up on its side. So first things first, we're going to score I'm going to score the finish off the side of the nut. Very light strokes. And I work my way down to the bottom of the nut. Can you make sure that I'm not blocking anything there? So I need to sometimes move the light so I can see. Then once I get my bottom slot cut, I just take a scalpel and give myself a couple of quick cuts right up the nut. Flip the guitar over, do the same thing here. And normally I would have the guitar, actually I would have the guitar in my workstation to do this, so I don't have to hold the guitar up and work on it at the same time. But I'm scoring along the bottom of my nut. Very light cuts. I'm not trying to cut the finish as much as I am giving a channel for the scalpel cross in. So then after a number of cuts, I will then come up and slice straight up, free up the lacquer on either side of the nut. On most guitars, almost every nut I make for a guitar, if it came in with finish on the end of the nut, I make sure it goes out with finish on the end of the nut, just so it looks like it's supposed to. You can, if you want, flake this away. I normally don't. But that's the sides of the nut. Then comes the most important part, which is back here. Gibson and a number of other companies, there's finish on the back of this nut. I believe this nut was cut while it was on the guitar. I think that's the way Gibson's doing it, which is why very often you'll see them when they're poorly cut. The back of the nut is shaped, and then there's this tiny little shelf here of nut material behind it, because whatever is shaping their nuts, and I presume that's a plec now, is coming over the top and shaping it to the top of the guitar or the top of the neck. But this is how I make sure I don't lose lacquer on the back of the neck. I start here and actually cut with the razor blade against the nut, or cutting into the nut, rather than cutting in. I'm not trying to cut the sliver between. And you're going to notice very quickly that with every time I pass, I increase the angle of my blade. So I'm creating a slot in which this can travel, so this doesn't accidentally wander out and cut the guitar or flake finish off. And if I feel I need to do that again, I can come back and you can see slivers of finish that I'm removing from the back of the nut. And every time I come past, I increase my blade like that. And once I'm satisfied that I've got a nice ridge there and a break line, that I'm not going to cause any finish damage when I push the nut out. Now, when I say removing a nut upwards, it's actually not upwards, but I don't give it any opportunity to go anywhere else. So I put a piece of plexi, put tape on mine just to protect the guitar from me. Put a piece of plexi on the back of the nut here. I take a couple of quick grip clamps, little mini ones. I get that to the back of the plexi, to the part of the guitar where it'll grip the strongest. And it won't slide off. There we go. And I get those good and tight. And that's what that looks like. Now we take our nut knocker, which is this. It used to be used for something else. I don't even remember. I've been using this for 30 years.
Call it Betty, right?
Yeah, I think we call it Bertha.
Bertha was the slanted one, this one was Betty.
Okay. So this one sits on the fingerboard that way. It has a curved bottom to it, so it sits indexed on the fingerboard as opposed to flat, which means it would wobble around. So that sits right up against there, up against the nut. And at this end, I use a small hammer and I tap. I don't give it a whack. I'm not trying to get it off in one shot here. And I'm waiting. I just heard it go, and I heard that little crack. Now, if we come around to the side here, I wonder if I can get this on camera. And we look at the nut shelf as I'm tapping that. it's moving up. That's what I call levitating a nut, because it comes straight up out of the slot, clean as a whistle. It's got a lot of glue on the front edge of this. I can see as I'm looking down into the slot. A little bit of wood loss here, but I see a bunch of glue at the bottom of the slot, so I've got a lip down there, and I've got a bunch of glue against that slot. But that's the way I remove most of my nuts. They go straight up, because this doesn't give it the opportunity to go anywhere else. If you try to knock a nut out without anything behind it, your peg head overlay is going to act like this device. However, this is not strong enough. So this is going to want to come this way, and it's going to push this off, and cause all sorts of cracking behind you. So between scoring first and moving the nut up, we get a pretty clean result there. There's hardly anything there to worry about. Any white stuff underneath, there's still some nut material there, but any of that I can clean up later. What was your question, Miguel? Was that you, Miguel, who asked that question?
Yeah, can you show us how to do the angle for the Martin nut?
How to do the angle in what way? How to make that tool?
Yeah, I know you have like a jig for that matter.
Well, what I do is I just calculate the angle that I would need for a Martin style nut, and I cut it into a piece of wood. Then I glue the file onto that, and I shape the file down. I just sanded it down so it meets the outer edges of the thing, of the piece of wood. So then if this were a Martin style nut, which this is too big to go in there, if this were a Martin style nut, then I would just be using that, because that then indexes against my fingerboard. So when the first time I make one of these, I'm dealing with a nut shelf that's either already been cleaned, like with a chisel. I know it's at the angle I want it, or if I get a Martin that comes in, that I knock the nut out just the way you saw with the plexi behind it, and I remove it as clean as I just did. If I have a perfect slot that I have, say, okay, that's my guinea pig slot, I will then take a piece of wood and I'll make a huge tall nut, almost out of a piece of wood. Then that gives me my angle for the bottom of this piece of wood that I can then laminate just a regular cheap file to.
Okay.
These are everybody's seen these really cheap files you can get, like at Harbor Freight or where have you. And it's all it is just one of those files that I've laminated to a bottom of a piece of wood. And every time I come up with an angle or a guitar that has an angle that I don't already have or that I want, I'll just make another one of these. I have drawers full of them for different guitars, and I can just grab the one I need. So that's my way of dealing with that. I have tried Stu Mack recently made angled Martin style nut files that have an angle cut into them. I think you can see that.
Yes.
I saw them. I bought it immediately. I wanted to love it so very much. I had to send it back. I had to send 2 or 3 of the first ones back because every single one I got was bent,
Yeah.
curved, which is not going to help me when I'm cutting a nut. So, and after 2 or 3 times of getting sent, curved ones, I I gave up the ghost on it. I so much wanted to love this, but you know, alas, it's not going to work. But it was a neat idea, though. So that's the nuts. That's removing a nut, you know. And then, as I said before, for me, cleanup mostly involves,
Chisels.
mostly involves chisels or, you know, machinist blocks. One of these days, I'm going to convince James Roadman to mill me one of these that has the Martin angle at the bottom of it, so I can use that one as well.
Yeah.
Just let me know when.
What'd you say? What'd you say, James?
Just let me know when.
20 minutes from now.
Okay. On it.
So
Can you
that's the shelf, and that's removing of the nut. Now it comes making a nut.
Yes.
So here it is. I don't make nuts. I've seen in many places, mostly on Instagram, and I commend everybody for doing it. When somebody posts about something that's a handcrafted nut or a hand-carved nut, I have all sorts of admiration for that. I really do. I can't do it. A handcrafted nut takes so long to do. Sitting there with files and saws and hand saws and sandpaper on a block and all of that stuff, I don't have the patience for it. It's one of these jobs that I needed to get faster at, and I needed to figure out how to do it. So what I call my nuts, instead of being handcrafted, they are belt crafted. So when I'm making a nut, when I'm making a nut, I stand over here. I'm sitting in front of two belt sanders, and this is where the entire nut gets made. The only time I deal with a guitar is when I need the guitar to index something for me. I don't like to walk back and forth between me and the guitar. I try to do it as few times as possible. Nowadays, with the workstation, I'm able to put the guitar into a docking station right here, so that if I need to index the nut against my shelf, it's right here. I can put the guitar upright, have it right here, just so I can mark the nut, and then I cut it. To me, making a nut has to be quick, because the faster I can make it, the more profitable I am. Not only that, I also, and many of you have heard me say this before, I don't make one nut at a time. When I'm ready to make a nut for a guitar, it comes in here and it hangs out in the tool room until there's another nut that needs to be made for another guitar. So I'll have one guitar here waiting for a nut there, another guitar there waiting for a nut, a guitar there waiting for a nut, a guitar down there which is waiting for a nut, a guitar there waiting for a nut, a guitar here waiting for a nut, and maybe even one or two guitars here waiting for a nut. I like to make several nuts at the same time because it's the kind of operation that's very repeatable, and if I do it in such a way where I cut it down to certain steps, I can do several guitars at once, cutting down the time for all of them, because all of that shit you got to get out in order to make a nut only has to come out once instead of 6 times. Incidentally, just another quick demo. Removing a fender nut to me isn't that hard, but I'll show you very quickly how I can cope with that. Here's a SRV Strat that's going to be having its nut removed. I haven't removed it yet, so we'll see how this goes. My favorite, can you put that back over there? My favorite tool for that, I found it at a flea market, and I'm sure they're probably in Harbor Freight or those kind of cheap stores somewhere. Little pair of nippers that have the angled handles on them. They're awesome because I can come down here. I'm sorry I can't get that lower, but I can come down here and I grab the nut and I rock. I don't know if you can, here, why don't you do this? Hold it right like that and just hover right there. So I come down here, I grab the nut and I rock just a little bit and I move along, and to me it's just like removing a fret, and I'm trying to loosen the glue joint so I can get it to come up. I'm not pulling, I'm not squeezing really hard because I'll crack the nut, and I continue back and forth. It only takes about a minute or two. And you can see there, if you get in close, I think you can see that I'm breaking. There it comes. That's all there is to it. So, and that's all it usually takes with most fender style nuts. You know, it's an easy removal. So back to making a nut. Let me come over here. I'm not going to actually cut the nut today because I can't think of a more boring thing to watch than watch me standing at a belt sander for 10 minutes, maybe 12, 15. But when I make a nut, we start with a blank. I like big nuts for blanks. That's our first pun for the day. I use ox bone mostly.
Solid one.
When I make a nut, I make it in 6 cuts. And I'm going to show them all to you right now. So what I did yesterday, or the day before, was I actually made 6 versions of those nuts down to each cut so that I can demonstrate how they're made. What was that question?
Nugget.
Oh,
What
somebody
if,
asked
what
about
if
that.
what if a strap nut is glued with so much super glue that the method you mentioned, I'm guessing, does not work?
Well, I've had ones that you know that are tough to get out, and then everybody pretty much is aware of the method where you saw through the middle of the nut and collapse it in.
Yeah.
That's what I'll go to if I've got a nut that's just not coming after a minute or two. You know, I have on occasion put a little heat on a nut. You just take a soldering iron, stick it on the top of the nut, and then I try my wiggling again. 8 out of 10 times that works. In fact, I could probably say, in all honesty, I can't probably remember the last time I had to cut a nut in half to collapse it.
Mhm.
That must have been, I don't even know if it was while we were in the shop, which is now 4+ years. Yeah, it was at our last location, and I think I did one 6 years ago. I just, I don't have that much trouble with them. I think when it comes to that stuff, most people get into trouble because patience is your friend. And what happens is people get impatient and they're trying to get the nut out quicker. I'd rather spend another 2 minutes getting a nut out rather than, if it doesn't come out after a minute, grabbing a saw, which is, it's not terrible. It's not, if you use a depth stop like on a fret saw, that'll keep you from going through the nut shelf. But on a curved nut, you can easily accidentally go through the middle, especially if somebody's done some stupid stuff underneath that you can't tell how deep a nut you have. But so here's where we are when we start our blank. Now, when we start a blank, I start with a large blank. I go back and I reach for the machinist's spacer that we had mentioned before. And I stand here. I turn on the belt sander and I sand material off the nut. I constantly, after every few strokes, or turning it over, or turning it left, or moving it up and moving it down and moving it left and moving it right, just depending on where I want to move material from, I come over here and I drop it on my table, and I check to see if it's the same size as my spacer. And I just run my fingers over it. If I can feel a lip one way or the other, I know, and I can turn it around. I can check it here. I can turn it around and check it here. And I can turn it around and check it here. And I just feel for that lip. So I'm sanding, moving it over here, feeling it, sanding again, feeling it over here. If I feel like this side here is coming down more than this side, I know to take material off of this side or to this side to compensate so that I can stay square to my index no matter what the nut. If it's a 1/4 inch nut, I'm going to be using a 1/4 inch spacer. If it's an 1/8 inch nut for a fender, I'll be using an 1/8 inch spacer. If it's somewhere in between, like a 3/16 or if it's 11/32, I just collect these in as many sizes as I can whenever I'm at a flea market or anything like that. I'm not a machinist, so I can't make them. James could, and he probably has them, and he's made himself. This one was made by a guy by the name of Tantung. So, and
Had a gauge block that?
it's a gauge block, but I think these most machinists will make them for themselves.
Oh, okay.
I just
How many of those? How many of those do you have, Doug?
I probably have about 10 or 15 of them. You know, in different sizes. You know, if I'm at a flea market, and I see one that I don't for a size I don't have, I just grab it. I also do have. Let me grab it over here. And as I said before, I'm not a machinist, so I don't machine these types of things, but I do haunt, as many of you know who've seen our Instagram page, all sorts of flea markets. And here, for example, is another set that I found, years ago. That is a set of spacer blocks that were machined by a machinist. And there's, dozens of different sizes in here if I need something that's an in-between size. And he's got them all etched with, 101 thousandths, 102, 103, 104, 105, all the way up to, all the way up in the fives and 375, 380, 4375, 500, 3125, So it's when I see them and I see a size I don't have or a size that I think is going to be useful, I grab it and it becomes part of my collection, In my nut, where I keep my nut tools, I have about 10 or 12 of them of, this size for different size nuts, in different widths and different thicknesses. There's an 11/32 here somewhere, not 11/32, 7/16, excuse me, 1/8, and so forth and so such. And most flea markets, you'll find them for $1 or $2. They're not very expensive, or less. But I do use them here, so this way I'm not going back and forth between the guitar and the belt sander 1,000 times. See, oh, does it fit yet? Oh, does it fit yet? Oh, does it fit yet? If I know I have a 3/16 slot and this fits nice and snug, as we just found in the Les Paul nut slot, then this is my guide that I'm cutting it to. So my first cut is to bring this right down to where it meets that perfectly. I can barely feel any lip on either side, on the side that I know is going to fit the shelf already because I made this yesterday. It's got a very smooth texture. I can tactily feel whether or not it's got a lip one way or the other. If it's got a lip where one nut is larger than the spacer, and I can feel the lip this way, I know I got to keep cutting it to sander. If it's a little bit of a lip here, but almost none here, I know I got to be taking material off this side. So then I just move on my belt sander where I need to in order to cut material off of that part of the nut. Is that clear as far as cutting on the belt sander? how to cut more material off of one side than the other? To everybody? Yes, no, indifferent? Am I preaching the... Come again?
Go ahead and over-explain it, just in case.
Okay, well, when I'm cutting a nut on the belt sander, where I'm taking material off the nut has everything to do with where my hand is relative to my elbow. You can keep this in frame. So if I want to take more material off of this side of the nut rather than this side of the nut, and I'm here, I move my hand down by definition, because you have a pivot point that is your elbow. By definition, I'll be putting more pressure on the back side of the nut here than the top side of the nut. So material will be removed faster from up here than it is down here. If it's the opposite, where I want to remove it faster from here than here, I move up or down. Or now, if I have a thinner side on this side of the nut rather than the top of the nut, if this was my bottom, and I want to remove material from the top of the nut, I move it towards me. I remain standing still, and I move my nut around depending on where I want to take material off. So if I feel this, and I've got more material here than here, and I want to remove material from the top side of the nut here, where my thumb is, I move it away from me, because now I'm putting more pressure on this side of the nut than here, as opposed to the opposite there. So I always stand square to the belt sander and let where my arm is dictate where material is coming off. That's where I'm, so if you can imagine a pivot point here, it's a circle. So if I'm coming up, by definition, I'm taking more material off the bottom of whatever I'm sanding rather than the top. That's just basic belt sander mechanics, to be able to remove material from where you want it to, rather than sitting there hoping that if you just keep pressing harder against the center of the belt sander, that'll eventually get square. Because this is flat and this isn't, doesn't automatically mean that this is going to become flat if I just merely press it against it harder and harder and harder. I have to move it around to adjust where the material is taking off. That's also why I don't generally sand with the belt sander flat, because then you're always pressing down. I don't want heavy amount of pressure. I just want a lot of material, meaning the grit of the sandpaper, moving past what I'm holding while I'm moving it around. I'll turn on the belt sander just for a second, just so I can show you what that looks like. But excuse the excuse the sound of the dust collector and the belt sander.
Doug, can you hear me?
I didn't hear a thing.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Bohannon would like to know what grit sandpaper you're using on that belt.
It's all the belt sander grits I use is 80 grit.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm not pressing very hard. Did Bo say something about when was the last time I cleaned this?
No, that was Robin.
Okay. Well, the last time I cleaned this belt was probably just before I made all of those nuts. So
Oh, okay.
forgive
it's
me,
fairly
Robin.
fresh.
Yeah. So.
Do you like a little bit of a bone patina on your paper? Do you like it a little bit?
Well, I'll clean it. Well, I'll clean it before the next time I go to start using it. But I was preparing for this rather than.
I guess more what I was saying is, like, when they're brand new, they can be a little hard on your blanks.
They can be, but that goes away pretty quickly. When I put a fresh belt on there, I'll normally sand down some some blocks or something like that for jigs and fixtures that I've been meaning to get to anyway, just to take the edge off the paper. I don't change my belts very often. This one's probably been on there for quite a good long time. But you saw how when I was moving around, I'm not pressing very hard at all. And in fact, I could probably have held that nut blank against the belt without it moving with just my fingertips. In fact, I'm just using my fingertips between my thumb and my other fingers. I could probably hold it with just my middle finger if I didn't want to risk it slipping out and me removing a lot of skin. Another thing, by the way, that all of you should make if you haven't already is just a hunk of wood with a couple of slots in it indexed so you can drop it right on your belt that way. So this now is a table that I can sand saddles on without worrying about that saddle disappearing down into the belt sander and having to go fish it out or never see it again. That platform, if you make one for your belt sander, will also work for this against your disc sander as well. So this way I can get right up close without having to worry about whatever I'm sanding being dragged down into that gap. When I'm trying to get something that's thin, if I'm making shims or if I'm making anything like that, then I can just rest down here and sand if I wanted to. But if I'm trying to shape a blank where I'm trying to take material off different sides faster than another side, down here doesn't help me.
Hey Doug, are you saving yourself any room for a finer grit of sandpaper, like hand sanding, or are you going right to your dimension?
I'm going right to my dimension.
Okay, cool.
Partially because I keep belts on my sanders for so long. Now I do keep different belts for different things. I've got one really worn down there that will polish something up that's got hardly any grit left on it. I got others hanging over there that are for wood or for other things. I got like a couple of belts here that this one here is a little bit more aggressive, and I use this for like aluminum and stuff like that. And I don't want to dirty up my belts that I use paper on. So I'll quickly change belts, before I'm ready to do something fairly often. So let's come over back to the guitar and let's just quickly run through my 6 cuts, because that's all there is to me making a nut is the next 6 cuts. So my first cut is just sizing my blank to where it fits in the slot that way, and it's square, and it's a tall nut that sits very firmly in the slot. Very is that centered? Yeah. So that's my first cut. It fits very tightly. It's not going to move. It's square to the bottom. Actually, that one's not square to the bottom, but that one's my first one to thickness, and that's in there pretty tight. Then I square up my bottom, so I cut this piece here to match the bottom of my slot, so I can't see any air coming through from the other side. So if I'm here looking at the nut, that's my second cut right there. So I don't want to see any air coming through there whatsoever, or any light actually. If I'm here, I don't know if that's focusing as it should because the light's behind it, but I don't want to see any light coming. That it's nice and square, fits good and tight. And that's my second cut. Once I'm here, the next 3 cuts, Isha, I need you behind this. My next 3 cuts are as follows. Come around this side. Mm-hmm. Hang on.
Good.
Yep. With a mechanical pencil, I draw right on the guitar. I draw that ledge, my bottom ledge, a little bit of my back ledge, and I have a shape of my nut on my blank, which I cut precisely to the base side. And I always do the base side first because that's usually where I'm standing. So that cut I make at the belt sander, upside down at the belt sander. If my belt sander were here, like that, I'm holding it upside down with the pencil line. So I'm cutting it and moving it this way till I come square, or to the shape of that line. This one happens to be fairly square at the bottom, but it has a little bit of a line coming in. It's not perfectly square. So I will cut precisely to that shape, precisely to that line, like that. And I will sand off, and this is something you have to practice. I'll sand off exactly half of the pencil mark and then test it back on the guitar. This is while I have the guitar behind me. And I don't want to feel any line there whatsoever. I want to feel when I've got it flush there. I don't want to feel any lip whatsoever, and I don't right now. It's perfectly smooth, and if I close my eyes, I couldn't tell where the nut started and where the guitar did and where the guitar continued. So that's cut one. Once I've got that there, I'll go back to my mechanical pencil. I'll mark the side of my nut over here. I'll mark the bottom of the nut here and the back of the nut here, same way, and I'll cut the treble side. Put it down. I'll cut the treble side so that that mark is there. Now on a Gibson, most Gibson guitars at the factory these days the nuts are being shaped along with the neck, which is why on almost every Gibson I work on, the treble side of the neck has this really terrible shape to it, like that. So it's got this deep, you can see here on this side, we had pretty straight line. Over here, that's a pretty deep dive into the curve of the neck. So now I need to follow that, and I will make that my fourth cut, where I cut the treble side of that to here. And that will match that cut there, and I'll cut it right down, right on the belt sander, and I'll continue to sand off that that pencil mark until the pencil mark is almost invisible. And that's something to practice, to be able to sand something right down to a pencil line and then sand that pencil line in half. Then I'll check it against the guitar. If I check it against the guitar and I run my finger here and I can feel a lip, then if I do feel that lip, then I run my pencil over that lip again and go back to the belt sander and continue to sand that off until I reach that pencil on again.
Hey Doug, Dan is asking, what do you cut the nut ends off with? I'm assuming you must lop some off with the bandsaw first, or do you go straight to the belt sander?
I go straight to the big belt sander. If you want to come over here, I don't bother lopping off stuff just because I'm impatient, you know, and I'm not gonna saw it off. Occasionally,
Can I ask you?
yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
What I'll do occasionally, if I've got a huge piece there. Occasionally I'll quickly, come over to the bandsaw and lop it off. But
Okay.
usually I usually regret that move because sometimes the bandsaw is aggressive enough that it'll chip off part of the nut.
Chip, yeah.
If I'm trying, because I have a tendency to try to get too close. So I'll come
Yes.
over here and I'll take it off on the big belt sander down to where I'm almost at the line. Then I hop over to my other belt sander, the small little one. I've had this one for close to 35 years now, this old Delta, which just keeps humming. Hums louder and louder every time I turn it on, but it still hums. And I come over here and I make the cut this way, where I'm rubbing against the sander in the line of the pencil line. Let me grab an uncut one. The one that preceded this. Yeah. And if I have a pencil line against if I have, and you can see, maybe, I don't know if you can with zoom, but there's a pencil line against that edge. Hold it still, just put it down.
It's not high enough that way.
Doug, while
So-
you're doing that, can I ask you, is your order of operation and cuts here, are you doing kind of risk management? Like I've seen people like cut their nut slots first and then do the sides of the nuts, but that always
I
seems.
don't do any risk management. I'm showing you precisely the order of the cuts. First cut, size it to the width of the slot. Second cut, get the bottom of the slot or the bottom of the nut to match the bottom of the slot of the guitar. If that's already at a perfect 90 degrees, I'm happy with that. I'm happy to do that, but I'm not going to bother squaring up the nut slot just to make it perfect. I'll make the nut match the flat part of the bottom of the slot. Then I cut the bass side, then I cut the treble side. And when I'm doing that, I'm rolling it against my belt sander this way. And you can turn that on? I'm going to turn on the machines just for a second. No, hit the button with the thing up. No, hang on.
I do it from the remote.
You reset the machine. So, there, I'm able to lean against the belt sander, but I'm not taking off all of the pencil line there. I don't know if that's in focus or not.
It's pretty subtle.
There you go. But you can see the pencil line right at the top there. But it's the kind of thing where I'm very, very hardly pressing at all. I'm just kissing it against the sander. That takes a bit of practice, but it's the most efficient way that I've been able to find to do it. If I leave my belt on here long enough, I get a really shiny edge to the edge of the nut, so I'm not going to have a whole lot of polishing to do later. That's a nice kind of very polished edge. So my second cut is my treble side, or my fourth cut, excuse me, is my treble side. So 1, 2, 3, and then my fourth cut is here, and I can barely feel a lip. I don't feel a lip on either side. It's nice and smooth to both sides. So I always cut the sides first to match the top. Then we use our ubiquitous half a pencil, and I draw the line on the nut top, on the fret tops to the nut, and I come up with my next cut. and I go right to the pencil line.
Wait,
So
I
that
thought
was,
I thought we sent you a Looth saver.
we do have a Looth saver, and I do use it, but this is the fastest way I know how to do it. So
All right.
if speed is my goal, this is it, and I cut it right to that pencil line, right there, and that's the top of the line of where my strings are going to be. If I need to check it after my nuts fit with that curve, I just grab my ruler, drop it on my first fret at the top of the leading edge of the nut, and if I've got a gap there, I'm good. I know I'm at where I need to be, just enough above the first fret to give myself clearance before I cut my slots in. So that's my 5th cut, and then my last cut is to shape this edge, and my back edge to the curve that I'm looking for the nut, and that will wind up looking like this. So that's my final cut. That's my 6th cut. I've got my edges sanded over and my back rounded. Now, back in the day, manufacturers, especially if you were doing warranty work, they were particular about making sure that when you made a Martin nut, it looked like a Martin nut. And when you made a Gibson nut for Gibson, it looked like a Gibson nut. Nowadays, they don't seem to care very much because they're all either made of some form of injection molded plastic, and they all kind of look alike now. As far as material is concerned, I pretty much only stick with bone. I'm not a big fan of tusk. I don't think it sounds very good at all. I think I don't think it's very good nut material. I think as a company, I think they're geniuses. Because only geniuses can rebrand injection molded plastic to be called man-made ivory and get away with it. But beyond that, this is what your nut should look like when it's done. And if we quickly go back to the belt sander, I'll show you what that motion looks like. I'm not going to do the whole thing now, but I do that entire thing standing at my small belt sander. I start with the ends. I rest my hand against the table, and I cut my curve this way against my thumb, using my thumb as a fulcrum. I cut the other curve over here. Then I cut the back by moving the nut back and forth and spinning it at the same time. Does anybody want to see what that looks like, or is that pretty routine?
Do it.
Okay, let me put on a mask. Hmm?
Now, Doug, I noticed that on one of your hands, you have a bit of a boo-boo. Was that for making?
I couldn't hear what you just said.
I said, I noticed on one of your hands there, you have a little bit of a boo-boo. Is that from making the nut?
You really want to know what that's from?
No.
That's not from making a nut. I made all 6 or 7 of these nuts yesterday without cutting myself. I cut myself shaving my head this morning on my finger.
Okay. Okay.
And you can edit that part out.
We'll get that under nuts about head shaving.
That's true. So, that's the same nut that I have, and that's as long as it takes to cut that part of the nut. Then the rest of it is just polishing it up and gluing it on the guitar. After that, of course, comes string slots. So that's my entire nut making process. The number 6 that I made yesterday, which was making a nut from start to finish, I timed it yesterday. It took me 11 minutes to get to this point. 9 minutes to get to this point. So that's about all that takes when you're doing it all on a belt sander with enough practice.
That's like Guitar Factory level speed on that, by the way.
So once the nut's made, then I 1 drop of super glue dead center on the fingerboard leading edge. Glued in, pressed into place, and just a quick clamp to glue that in. 5 minutes later, it's ready for slotting. Ready for spaces and slotting. Now, before we go on to that, because we're gonna move on to talking about string spaces and slotting. Then we're gonna pass it off to Dan because there are several ways you can calculate that. But does anybody have any questions about everything or anything we just saw?
Yeah, I heard that super glue is bad for tone and you should use hot hide glue. Do you have any opinions on that?
Well, the amount of super glue you use, or the amount of hide glue, or the amount of fish glue, or quite frankly, the amount of anything that you would use as an adhesive is so minuscule that it, if I were going to take your question seriously, it wouldn't matter.
Doug, just a quick one. Going right back to the bottom of the slots.
That's what I'm talking about with super glue, by the way. That's the size of my dot on the edge of the fingerboard. There's not a lot holding that in place. It's just to keep it there for moving. It's a nice tight fit to begin with. I don't want lots of glue holding it in because I don't want to give the next guy trouble getting it out if he needs to. Sorry, you were saying, Andy?
Yeah, I've had a number of them come where people have had a go, obviously use things like files, and to get the slot flat, you're actually going to end up going quite a bit below the fingerboard.
Yeah, sometimes you have to,
because you say make the nut to the guitar. Would you just continue and make it below, or would you build the slot up with a piece of shim stock or something like that? Is there?
Well, I think it really depends on the case because I've had worked on guitars where when they've come in, they've, as you said, somebody's already spent a fair amount of time on a guitar and they've cut the nut slot down. It's a case by case basis. If I think the guitar would be better off by getting some mahogany in there and see if I could touch it up well enough on the sides so it doesn't look like, I have a shim in there, I'll do that. If it's not too deep, because of course the deeper and deeper you go there, the more at risk you're putting that part of the guitar of breaking. I've seen some nut slots that I couldn't find a blank tall enough to be able to fit in over the years. So, in those cases, you'd probably be better off putting in a little bit of mahogany first, but usually it's just a matter of cleaning up, squaring it up. I'm not gluing to that surface anyway, so as long as I can get it clean, even if it's on top of some other stuff, I'm not looking for, because since I'm not gluing to that surface, I'm not necessarily worried about that. One last quick, does that answer your question, Andy?
Yeah, absolutely.
One quick tip about the bottom of nut slots. You all probably saw the post about this last week or so, last couple of weeks. This is how I cut the bottom of my fender style nut. I have a fender nut here that I, whittle down to, 7 1/4 or so. And this is an SRV strat that has a 12-inch radius. That's not going to match. I know there's a tendency of people putting it abrasive on here and rubbing it back and forth against the guitar. No offense, but I'm not a fan. It's fine if you do that. Not saying it's wrong, but if you're like Aaron Jones, which dutifully made one of these last week, I can set this to any radius I choose by tightening or loosening my turnbuckle. In this case, I've already set it to a 12-inch radius for my fender here, chuck it up in my vise, and I can take my nut and sand it. And it's done. It's to a 12-inch radius. Because I'm sanding lengthwise across an entire length of sandpaper, it's pretty aggressive sandpaper, as long as I'm keeping it square, now I can fit that into the bottom of the slot, and it fits my 12-inch radius perfectly. So, I love these. I've been using them for 25 years now. I have a good collection of them, all hanging over there.
Hey Doug, going back to the repairing of the nut slot, do you charge extra to repair a nut slot, or is that amortized over all of the nuts that you do? Just like some you have to repair, some you don't.
I charge a good amount of money to make a nut, so I kind of consider that inclusive in the the average price of making nuts.
You mind? Is it a trade secret what you get for a nut these days?
No, I bill it out at an hour and a half of my shop labor rate. That's all it is. So whatever your shop labor rate is, I bill everything in time rather than dollars. I have a shop labor rate per hour, and then I charge average jobs for average hours of time that I think are appropriate for those particular jobs. Incidentally, I think I was talking to Bo about this the other day. If I get better at doing something, meaning I get faster at making a nut, I don't charge less for it because I make more money that way. So quickly about calculating string slots. I don't know if you all remember these. Does everybody remember these?
Yep.
Okay. I bought a set of these back in early 90s, I guess, or mid 90s. These say copyright 1993, so I guess that's when they were created.
Mine's copyright 92, Doug.
Okay, so you bought yours before I bought mine. I may have actually bought it before yours because I bought it and then I got rid of them. And then I got them again and got rid of them and got them again, and recently bought out the contents of somebody's shop and got myself another set of them. So I have a few sets of these. And I've never understood this, but this will give you an equally spaced nut for whatever string width is in there. But I stopped using them about 10 minutes after I started using them because I accidentally got a second set at one point, and I discovered something. To me, an equally spaced nut means that the spaces between the strings are equal. So if I look at, for example, 37.5 millimeter, and this is the electric gauge set, and I pick any set, let's say we're talking about our Gibson here, let's say we're talking about 10 to 46, or say we're talking about 9s, 9 to 42. If I then look at the 37.5, well, since we're talking about a Gibson, let's talk 36.25 because that's a Gibson scale. So if I look at 9 to 42, there's my spacing. If I look at, I don't know, let's say 12 to 54, there's my spacing right there. If I then line these up, they're precisely the same. How can they be precisely the same if they're different thicknesses of string? There we go. I never understood that about these gauges, that they're virtually the same with too little difference between one string to the other. I've done that with this on several different strings at the same width. And I've never trusted this because they're all, if I look at the 33 against the 33, and if I take two random sets of strings and I put them right up against each other, they are precisely the same width. That's a 9 to 38. The other one's 10 to 38. If I do this, where I just take two random sets of strings and I line them up, they're virtually the same, with not enough difference to counteract, to even quantify. So I always struggled with that because I never liked the way that was. I just found these to be too inaccurate to be useful. Dan is going to talk about this one because I don't understand it, but he will. I'm going to show you how I do my string calculations for laying out slots. To me, it's a simple mathematical equation that's not very hard to do. Everybody shies away from the math, but I'm going to show you how I do it, which is fairly easy.
Standing by with calculator if you need it.
Yeah, my extra crispy is my human calculator because I may need him to turn millimeters into thousandths of an inch for me. So the whole principle behind this is that if you equally space a nut with the string slots into 6 equally distant strings, you're going to have thicker strings that wind up crowding each other out, and thinner strings that by comparison have too much space in between the strings. So you'll have this sense that even though the strings are an equidistant slot from one another, that you'll have a crowded bass side of your fingerboard. So the answer typically is then you plot your outer two strings, you divide by 5 because you have 5 equal spaces, then you take the other 4 strings that are in the center and you adjust them left or right in order to compensate for the thickness of the string. And that's where the math part of it always becomes difficult for everybody, because you start somewhere and you start compounding any kind of error as you're moving from one side of the guitar to the next. If you're starting on the treble, on the bass side, you're trying to move your A string away from your E string, and then your D string away from your A string, and then your G string away from your D string, and so forth and so such, until you get over here and realize that your E and your B string are too close together and your G string's way the heck out here, and somewhere the math went awry, and then you get frustrated and you grab for a ruler like this or like this, which I'm sure works. I just don't understand the proportionality aspect of it. This, I understand, is each notch is 4/1000ths of an inch away from the previous notch, and by definition your strings get wider by 4/1000ths every time you go up one string to the next. And I think that's brilliant because it makes for an easy rule you can slide all the way up across the neck until you find it. My trouble with this is that when it works brilliantly. When it doesn't work at all, Because if you have somebody come in with, say, a set of Tomastic infield strings, you're screwed. Because Tomastic infield strings have such a thick bottom and a thick top string, and such underweight inner strings, that you wind up with a spacing that still looks wrong. And then if you go back and you measure it, they're not equally spaced anymore because the weights are all off. Or you get that guy who comes in with a guitar and he wants 9s on top and 52 on the bottom. And then this is never going to work for you because the string spacing is off, because the weights are so unproportional to each other in that string set that you wind up having to move strings all over the place. And if you wind up cutting a slot in the wrong way, it winds up being difficult. So this is my method for doing so. And it's a simple matter of adding and subtracting. So if I'm looking at 6 strings, I will set my outer E here and here to where I want them on the neck first. That's usually about 3 millimeter inset from the edge of the fingerboard. 3 millimeter, 3.5 millimeter, sometimes 2.5. Depends on the guitar, depends on what you're dealing with. Extra crispy, what's 3 millimeter in thousandths of an inch?
All right, coming. Hold on a sec.
Uh-oh.
118.
Oh,
Thank you.
Dan beat me to it. 11811. Wow.
Okay, 118.
All right, I'm here. I'm ready now.
So you, all right. So you're 118 thousandths inset from the outer edges. If you're somebody who likes to move your bass string in a little bit to give it a little bit more breathing room over here, that's fine. I put them, generally speaking, the same side, each equidistant from the edge of the fingerboard. I find that doing it this way leaves me with a high E string that might have a little bit more forgiveness room on the treble side of the fingerboard and less on the bass side of the string. But here, this is the string that people are pushing back and forth more than anything else. So then once you find your calculations for where you, or your spots where you want your high and your low E, then I measure the distance from those 2 points. And if we were dealing with the world's largest guitar, it would be 3 inches, 3.432 inches here. If I'm doing it on a regular guitar where I'm dealing with, like this Gibson, I would probably be somewhere in the neighborhood of 36.25 millimeter, which in inches gives me roughly, depending on which one of these I choose, actually they're all the same, so it doesn't matter, 36.25. I could just set my calculator, my calipers to 36.25 and then just switch it to thousandths. But let's say that's 36 point. I'm going to set this to here. I'm going to start using my tools the way I'm supposed to use it. 36.25. If I set that there and switch it to there, I'm 1.427 inches. Extra crispy, you can take the rest of the day off.
There we go.
So I'm at 1.427 inches for the whole width from my E to E string. I'm then going to divide that by 5. Well, I'm not going to do this, forgive me. So now I know where I'm dealing with. Then I make a matrix. E, A, D, G, B, and E. I take my set of strings that I'm using. Let's say we're doing 10s for this customer. I got 10, 13, 17, 26, 36, 46 thousandths for each string. I then take half the dimension of each one of those strings so I know what I'm dealing with. So I'm dealing with 5 thousandths. In this case, I would be dealing with 6.5 thousandths. and half of 17. Forgive me. Actually, I don't need half of those. Well, I will need it eventually. 8.5. Here I'm 13. Here I'm 16, right? Or 16.18,
18.
forgive me. And here at 46, I'm dealing with 23. So I know my full length width of the string and I know my half width of the string. Now I take my 14.27, 1.427, and I add up my strings, and this is the kicker. If I'm looking at my 6 strings between here and here, my 1.427, I need to divide this space in half, but I need to divide this space by 5. However, I want to eliminate the strings from that number. I only care about the spaces. I don't care about the strings. So if we take half of our E string, the full width of all of our middle strings, and then half of our low E string, we will come up with a number that represents the width of the strings in between those 2 points. The reason why I'm only taking half of the lower and higher E is because I already have the high E and the low E plotted here and here. Those 2 strings, we already have the center point located. I don't care about the outside of that center. I only care about the inside of that center. So I take half of my E, the full complement of B through A, and then half of my low E, which gives me 5 thousandths plus 6.5 plus 8.5 plus 13 plus 18 plus 23. And I have 74 thousandths. So I take 1.427 minus 7.42.
Good. Quick question.
Minus 7.474 gives, what's the question?
I I don't know. Could you just redo the math there to get the 74? I think you might have put a couple of wrong numbers.
Did I hit the numbers wrong on the calculator? 5 plus 6 point, oh, so, yeah, I was adding halves.
Yeah, you're in the wrong column.
I was in the wrong column. So 5 plus 13 plus 17 plus 26 plus 36 plus 23 is my half there. That's better. 140. That's not still wrong. I'm still hitting the wrong number. 5 plus 13. Maybe I'm just not hitting the buttons hard enough. Plus 17 plus 26 plus 36. That's better. Plus 23. 120. That's better. So I have 120 thousandths of total string widths. So 1427 minus 120 gives me 1307. Now I take 1307, I divide that by 5. That number of 261 is what I want for the space in between the strings. Everybody with me so far?
Yeah.
Once I'm at 261, then you start, let me move this aside, and just to give you a visual representation, I already have my low E string. So now once I'm at my low E string, I add 23 thousandths to my 261 plus half my A string, 18. I now have 302. 302 is the space where the center of the A string goes. So you start from one end of the guitar to the other. I like to start at the bass string. I add half the value of my E string. I add the amount of my space, and then half the value of my A string, and it gives me the exact location for my cut of my A string. I repeat then, just referring to my matrix, then I go from the A string to the D string. So if I'm at A, I add half my A, which is 18. I add my 261, and then I add half my D, and that gives me my perfect spot for my D string. And I just keep plotting my way from E to E, one string at a time, just adding half the value of this string plus my space, half the value of that string. I will always have perfectly centered strings that are perfectly equally spaced from one another. And with that, I rest my case.
Okay, I was expecting the quadratic equation.
I told you it was actually simple math.
Okay.
So that's how I do that.
Question.
What if my pencil is off center? Is that what you want? Is that what you really asked, Nate?
No, for gluing the nut.
Yeah.
Some people say you need to put glue on the bottom. Some people say you need to put glue the part that goes next to the fingerboard.
I glue all of my nuts up against the fingerboard.
Okay, okay.
I don't like a whole lot of glue at the bottom.
But you put glue there.
Glue on the bottom is erosive. Like when we were talking about fixing nut slots, like a lot of that nut slot repair comes from trying to dig glue out of the bottom of the nut slot.
Okay.
But Doug's move of gluing it right up against the fingerboard is really the best move.
So
So-
that's for either Fender or Gibson Morton, right?
If you wanna come back to me at the computer, just
Yeah,
go.
hold on a second, let me find out. We got a lot of people in here.
So that's everything that I have for making nuts. That's everything I do. That's the whole routine. I've gotten to the point where I can, if I'm doing several nuts at once, I can easily do about 4 nuts in an hour, start to finish. I'm working on breaking that record to be 5 nuts an hour, so I can, make more money. That's my whole routine. The only last trick I'll mention to you in terms of cutting nut slots is if I'm cutting a nut, and I'll just show you in front of the computer over here. Let me see if I can put this strat nut back in. So if I'm cutting any one of the nuts, when I'm cutting my final depth of nut, I use feeler gauges under the string to do it. That's pretty routine. I leave the string at rest. So if I'm here cutting the string this way, if you got strings on the guitar, generally speaking, I cut my nut slots without strings on the guitar. I cut it and I use my file as a measuring device because I'm holding, if you've got a good file, I'm holding a straight edge. So as I'm cutting the slot, I'll come back and check to make sure that I'm not in contact with that first fret, that I've still got a gap there. And I keep filing until I'm just about touching it, and then I'll stop and I'll cut my final depth when the strings are on the guitar. In the case of if you've got a file where the file has got a curve bent into it from being used for so many years, then you just need to get a new file. But that's my way for checking my depths as well. So I'll use the file as my depth gauge because I basically have a straight edge built into the file, so I don't have to keep checking and putting a string in or checking and filing and pulling it out. I can just keep filing, I check, I keep filing, I check, I keep filing, and I check, and I know exactly when to stop because I've got a straight edge in my hand. So that's also just another quick tip for getting through it quicker, because
Do you do that with the neck sort of poker straight, or with a bit of a back bow, or a bit of...
I don't care. I do the net because I'm not setting the final depth there. I'm leaving a little bit of gap between me and the first fret, and that distance from the nut to the second fret. I don't care what the relief is of the neck. It's usually set pretty straight anyway if I'm working on the guitar. If I've already done fret work, it's pretty close to being reasonable in terms of whatever the relief might be. That distance is pretty short from one to the next, so I don't think the relief is a big, huge factor there. But that's my last bit of it. Yes, Watsky is correct. On a classical guitar nut, there generally is no glue. It's all string pressure putting down and a very tight fit, partially because a lot of classical guitars are adjusted very often by raising or lowering the nut in order to accommodate those guitars. They're not generally glued in.
One other thing, Nate Wood said, what if your pencil is off center? Do you ever like start from the E6, do your calculation over to your A, and then start at your E first, and then do your calculation over to your B, and then kind of meet in the middle? Or do you just go from one side over to the...
I go from one side
the next
to the other. I very rarely, if I follow the math that way, and I'm careful about where I put that, string slot, I'll cut the E with a razor saw first, so I know where my center is. Then I'll drop. What did I do with it? Then I'll drop my caliper right into that slot, measure my distance, and I'll use the caliper to run across the nut, and that'll score exactly where that is, that I can hit it with a pencil and see the line if I wanted to. So I'm not drawing a lot on the nut. I'm using this, to find the next spot, and these are sharp enough that they'll scratch a line right where I need it, that I can follow up, and I can index it very easily with with about an 8/1000 razor saw and start cutting it. So if there are no more questions, I'm going to pass it off to my pal Dan and let him resume with talking about how this works for slotting.
Dan's actually, I think he's wandered off. Should we go to James first?
Is Dan?
I'm here.
Dan, are you there?
I'm here.
I think you need to pin his phone, his other one.
Let's see here. Oh, I'm having a hard time. Actually, I'm going to remove this spotlight. Dan, can you do some talking for me?
Testing 1, 2.
Okay, you're on that one.
I see you.
All right, cool. Hold on one second. Oh my God. Okay, you're spotlighted. Oh geez.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I can't see you though. Can you go in front of the camera for a second and just wave?
I'm the camera guy.
All right.
Everybody left.
So what do you got? No, we got tons of people still here.
We got this little it's a little thing for old people that can't see as well as they did to be accurate, and it's on this little electromechanical miniature drill press that I bought a couple of years ago just because it looks so cool. I didn't know how small it was, and when it came, it's quite small. The biggest drill bit you could put in it is a 3/16, so it's a tiny little chuck, and it has a variable speed on it from 0 to 10,000.
10,000 seems pretty fast.
And I'll come in close on it. And what I like about this thing is I can really get accurate when I'm starting the nut out. You can see that, right?
Yeah.
What I have here is when StuMac, years ago, we made a tool that was for taking a bridge pin and putting in this little fixture and cutting your own slots.
Mhm.
If you wanted a fluted pin. And this was the test for it. But this sliding linear motion bearing was so expensive, we couldn't afford to make it. And we did make a version that was pretty crude, but didn't last long. So one end of this little block of brass that we made to sit, what it's sitting on is one of these things. That's a linear motion bearing. This cost about $60. And 30 years ago, that was way more money than we could put into a tool and sell. So I ended up with it. And then a couple of years ago, I just drilled a hole in the end of the brass block. And I have all my little pencil marks here that I've laid out. I lay these out with that metal proportional ruler that Doug doesn't like that much. And it works well for me. All I want to get from that really is the initial little peck from a small bit. And then I'll change bits and I can move things around by eye if I want to. But this slides back and forth. And this Allen cap screw just kind of puts pressure on this outside jaw. So I can slide this through. I can tighten it if I want to, so it won't move, or I can just tighten it and hammer it to the next piece, or I can hammer it for a fine adjustment. Like right there, I'm ready to make a cut.
Dan, you got any hammers smaller than that one?
Just one.
Yeah. Okay.
So here's a little cut. I can move it right across. These little cuts are about 15 thousandths, maybe 16, or just pecking it. It's a really tiny little end mill. And once I go all the way across this, I have 6 little cuts. I'll change bits.
So that nut, you've got that nut in there being held firmly enough so that the bit doesn't make it wander, but loose enough so that you can push it back and forth.
Yeah, I can slide it back and forth in this loose grip jaw, and then I can put different bits in it. Like these are little ball end cutters. So I could use that on the E, A, and D string to get them started. If I want to, I can actually widen the slot with these. Just tap it a little bit to the right and a little bit to the left. And here's a bit. It's another very tiny one. It's really short. It actually broke, but it still works. So I've got several sizes of bits that can get a nut started. And when I'm making a 12-string nut, it's really nice to have this. And for me, I just find that I don't blow as many nuts as I used to.
Cool.
That's fantastic.
You could make one of these pretty easy. You can buy these for about 50, 60 bucks. This would hold 2. And I made a brass block that screws onto this linear bearing. There's 4 little holes. This could be a piece of hardwood. There could be any number of ways of getting a little jaw in there. You could do this on a drill press, probably a Dremel tool in a stand, or any of the tiny little milling machines that a lot of people get, little hobby mills that are as small as this. Ian's got one.
I did.
that's my show and tell. As far as there's nothing more to show. I can say more if you want to put the camera on me, but I'd go back to the desk.
Okay, why don't we do that?
Up to you. How do you want to do it?
I'm walking over there now.
Okay, so you want on the
Now I see myself. I'll turn this off.
There you go.
I got you, Dan.
So as
Yes.
far as what do you do differently than what I did? That's what I'd like to know.
I'm trying to turn this off. Testing.
We can
You're
hear you.
good. No echo.
Testing. 1, 2.
No,
You
no,
hear
we
me?
got an echo.
Damn.
It's all right. Hold on. I'll mute that other one.
I'm trying to get. I'm trying to quit. Testing. I can't get off the Zoom
Hold on one
on my
second.
phone.
I believe Ian or whatever is the host can take you out.
Yeah, I think I got you. Try it now, Dan.
Testing. You
Now
hear
we're
me?
good. Yep.
It's still on my phone.
It's okay. We got it muted.
What did Doug say?
Oh, I was just asking if you have anything to add in terms of what I did, how you do things differently, because I'd like to know that, because I don't know of any other way to do a nut than what I just showed.
But there's so many different ways you could make a nut. Everything you did is very good advice, and it would work. I don't think I go through as many steps. Pretty much to make a nut, I square up the blank the same way you do with a chisel. I don't use files on those nut files on the nut too often. Like you, I like a chisel and chisel off the glue. I size the blank usually most of my life until we got these giant ox bones. The nut blanks have been closer in size to the actual size you want. Some of these are really got a lot of meat to take off of them.
Right.
And I'm more inclined to put 3 or 4 of those on some Danny West tape on a flat board and shove them through the thickness sander.
Okay.
Yeah, I think for the people that have those model machines thickness sanders, I'd like to get somebody to do a demo of those one of these days, because I know that they're getting those blanks dimensioned pretty quickly and pretty accurately. At least that's what some of them
Danny
say.
West would be good for that. I have one.
Yeah,
I loaned mine to Blake.
they are accurate within like 2000s. I've found for thicknessing. Yeah, they're really good.
Really, down to 2000s.
I will often take the nut blank of bone and when it's fitting tight, as far as pressing it in for the width, I'll take the nut blank and kiss it on the sander standing straight up and flatten that one end, and it creates its own scraper. I'll take the sharpened edge of the bone nut, like you're shoving those machinist blocks through it, and I'll scrape with the bone itself.
I do that too.
And it just, if it's sharp, man, it's the perfect scraper. I don't like files because you can chip lacquer off pretty easy with them.
Yeah.
And I like to go to get the blank as close to what it's really going to be right off the bat. I'll leave them hanging out on the edges and final do that later. That's a difference. No big reason. I can always tap it left or right that way if I'm a little bit off and if I took too much off to begin with. But I do like, well, the James Roadman's sitting on the fret nut scribing tool is unbelievable.
Should we Should we throw it to James? Maybe you can talk about that.
Yeah, I think that it can really scribe out and pencil out exactly where you want to be. Then I'll cut the top of the nut down really close to it and then do my slots.
Okay.
Just trusting that if I blow it, it didn't take me long to get there.
Uh-huh.
And I did blow one last weekend.
Oh my goodness.
Yep.
Not Dan Earlywine. If
Uh-huh.
Dan blow nuts, we got
I do not make lots of nuts because for a number of years I've had talented people working in my shop that's one of the first things they learn to do, which means it's like I might make 2 or 3 a year. And if you don't do it a lot, you get out of practice.
There you go.
And if you're getting older, you'll actually forget stuff that you knew.
Uh-huh.
So, yep, I love what Doug said, and I'm looking forward to Jamie's. Jamie gave me a tool some years back that I'm embarrassed to say that I lost. It got lost in a shop cleaning, or who knows what. Jamie may still be using it, and we'll find out. It's it fastens to a disc sander, and it's got a radius out. You can radius the top of your blank.
Oh my God, you lost. How did you lose that?
Things get lost, man. When I moved into the new shop from the old shop, it's probably been about 7 years now. Some things are gone.
Yeah.
I'm sure I can find another one.
You don't think Stu Mac did corporate espionage on you and stole it?
No, they saw it, but it wasn't anything they were interested in. And how long ago was that, James?
Oh, that was right around the last GAL. So it's probably been 6 or 7 years, I would think.
That's what I think.
Yeah.
Do you still have it?
Oh yeah.
Okay, you'll be showing it, right?
I'm sure I can find you another one if you'll use it.
I would.
Okay.
James, which one do you want spotlighted on you? Dan, thank you so much for sharing that.
See you guys.
Thank you, Dan.
I'll be around.
Thank you, Dan.
Do you want to pin both of them for a second and then
Sure.
So I'll talk for just a minute.
One second. I'm having a hard time. We got a lot of people watching today.
All right.
There you are, James.
Okay. Well, first I'd like to say thanks for both of your presentations. Doug, to watch you go through the math and look at Dan's jig, it makes me feel a lot less alone in the world. So I do a lot of the same operations, just in a slightly different order, because I've come up with some jigs that I use that necessitate that. So starting out your math, I use a spreadsheet to do the same math. That way I only had to wrap my mind around it once, and now I can just plug in the numbers.
Right.
But this is a let's see if you can see that. So this is just a screenshot of the spreadsheet that I use to work out that math. And what I do is I measure the outside distance between the outside two strings, and then it'll calculate all the other numbers. So I've got the common gauges of strings, and then I've got a custom one here. If I have a special set, I'll just come in and change the gauges of the string.
Can you back up a second? You said you measure the outside distance of what? The edge of the fingerboard to the string?
No, I'm just concerned with the distance between the strings. So I'll measure the outside of the high E and low E, or first and sixth string. And then it will subtract out the thickness of the string and then calculate the equal spacing for me.
So you're measuring the inside distance from the inside of the high E to the inside of the low E. Actually,
the outside of the high E and outside of the low E.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And I'll show in a minute, the sort of process that I go through.
Sure.
But this is just to explain the spreadsheet. And I got even a little more uptight about it. I found that I really like equal spacing between the third and the fourth strings, and then a little less between the fifth and the sixth.
Oh, really?
So I've sort of massaged the numbers to get what I think is visually the most pleasing spacing on the strings. but that's really probably taking it too far. But since it's a spreadsheet, I can do that, and I don't have to think about it again.
James,
So-
are we able to make that spreadsheet available? Do you think?
Oh yeah, yeah, definitely. So I'll start with I don't have a lot to add with squaring up the blank. I use a milling machine, and so that really makes things pretty quick and as near perfectly square as I can get. But for fender nuts, I don't know if you want to just pin the iPhone camera. It'll be probably easier to see in larger format. So I made this, and it's overly large because I really like my fingers. But it's got the inside and outside radius for fender nuts, and then I'll just go over and use a bearing bit on the router, and you can blast out a number of them and just throw them in the drawer. But that saves a lot of time. I would like to make the adjustable radius gauge of yours, or radius sander, so I can fine tune those. And so I would start out with a square blank.
You're cutting the bottom of the fender nut on a router table?
Yes, with a bearing bit that just rides along the aluminum edge of the radius.
You just solidified yourself.
Can you show that to the camera?
You've just solidified yourself as way cooler than all of us.
Oh, not so. But that it's really quick, and it just if you want to make five fender nuts to have in the drawer, that does it really fast. So I'll start out with a square blank, and then I'll end up with. I just chose a Fender guitar here because I have one that I can easily use. Okay, so then I end up with a tall blank with the radius bottom. I will put it in here, and then I will use the Ian Davin Looth Saber.
Oh, come on now.
And I've set on 50,000 says the gap that works, and I just go straight from the treble to the bass. I just use that one height on most gauges of strings. Let me see if I can get the camera in here. And then
Can you push the neck back a little bit?
Let's see. Sorry, I'm gonna stand up and do this way. It's hard with a stand there. All right, and then
you need to. Sorry, James. You need to pull back some so you can see more.
There you go.
There you go.
That work?
Cool.
All right, and then I'll just scribe my line there. And that's the height I want, plus the extra above the bottom of the slot. And then I have a special jig that I use for radiusing the top. And this is very similar to the tool that Dan was talking about that I use for saddles, but this is for doing nuts. And I've got a series of radius templates that go on the bottom. And so this one's the 9.5. This has got the ability to angle if you want to put an angle on the top of the nut, or if you wanted to make the bottom of a martin nut at a specific angle, you could put a flat template on here and sand that. So I've got a mock-up here of my sanding table. I used this at a demonstration once, and I've just got it permanently set up with a fence that's a set distance, and I make all my jigs around that distance, so I never have to move it or take it off the sander. And so what this will do, is that all right? Is I put the nut in there, and then these threaded rods will push it forward a little bit at a time, and I'll just sand it on the disc sander, and it'll sand right up to that radius, and I'll keep moving it in until I just sand away the line.
So that plastic piece on the bottom is your index.
That's my fence on the disc sander.
Right.
And it stops it as soon as it hits the template. It stops it, and we'll make that radius on the top.
Wow.
For those that can't see, there's like a little raised. There's a raised area there. Exactly. Yeah. So the bottom X is almost like a template routing thing, except template sanding.
And then so I'll end up with this. Let's see. Okay, so I run that up. That's a little. I run that up to the sander, and it's just blasted off everything except for the radius. And the way I'll check that is I'll come back over to the guitar, push it in, and then the nut gauge should just, you can see that it's causing just a little pencil line over the top. And I'll know that I'm right where I need to be.
Yeah, I'm getting jig envy.
And so that's a really fast way of getting to that point. And then this is where it gets really.
We all need that.
I'm sorry?
You need to make those for sale.
There, I think it does.
I really want to. Unfortunately, I'm having a hard time finding time to get all the things that I need to make done. And then, so, you know, I found that I've gotten really finicky about string spacing. So this is another jig that I've made. And this is really what necessitates doing things kind of in a backward order. So this is a jig for cutting the nut slots using the figures that I had programmed into that spreadsheet. And so on the guitar, I would just go, and I've got it extra long. It's sticking out over the edges of the fretboard. I just want basically a rough idea of where my high E string is going to be. And then I'll take it over to the jig, and it has two little clamps that clamp the nut in the jig. And then that moves in a sled. And then this little guide arm comes down, and I'll line that up with where I want my first slot. Okay. And then I will put and then this, it's hard to get it all in one shot, but this is a digital radius, a digital caliper. And I'll push the rod over until it touches and then zero it there. Okay. I'm gonna get my figures here. And then let me find my razor saw. And then it's pretty easy. Take the razor saw, make a little slot there, move it out of the way. I need to move the digital caliper 0.258.
I want everybody to notice that his digital caliper says Starrett on it. You may not get the same results if yours says Harbor Freight on it.
I have several Harbor Freight. I've got a handful of them that I leave around the shop.
Yeah.
Right. And so then I'll put that slot, move it out of the way. And I'll just go through these real fast.
James, this is like Skynet level nut making.
Oh.
Is anybody else just like giggling and cursing while watching this right now?
I think all of us.
All right.
All you need, Nate, is a milling machine. That's all you need.
About to get access to
Actually, just so you know, I got that little mini mill from Dan, and I think this is a project that, James, do you think a mini mill could handle this?
Probably, I think so.
It looks pretty reasonable size wise.
Oh yeah, I think you could do it. All right. And you really spend most of your time trying to get the digital caliper within a thousandth of an inch, not getting too finicky. All right. And the last one.
Doug, do you polish your nuts? Do you buff them on a buffer or anything?
I don't buff them on a buffer. After I'm finished sanding them up, I'll sand them from, I'll take some 220 and then I'll jump up to about 1,000, and then I'll grab a micro mesh stick and get it as shiny as I need with that, the 3 grits on the micro mesh stick.
Okay. So that's the slotting.
Jesus, please.
And then
I did tell you that I love you, right?
Well, thank you. I loved your presentation. I could not have done as comprehensive an explanation of cleaning the slots and shaping everything for sure. Okay, and then I may be the only one, but I really love these Ibanez style fret files.
You are the only one.
I know. For the rough, just for the rough work. When I get down to the final slots, I have smaller files that I use. But so I'll just take these and starting from I'll go all the way across with the gauge that I would need there, and then I'll move up. And then I'll go 3.
So James, I noticed you call them the Ibanez style. That's a real indication of how old you are.
Yeah. Well, these are what the tech that taught me early on. These are what he used, and
yeah.
So I've just kept using them, and I know a lot of people don't like them, but so all right.
So that's you just use them for your initial.
Yeah, I tend to use them for the nut slots on the bass strings, but if you do it on the treble strings and you're going to do them a little bit deeper, the slots start to look a little bit funny because they open up toward the top. So I'll use them for the bass strings, and then I've got narrow files for the treble strings. Okay, so now I've got my nut. I've got the outside strings on the guitar, and that way I can just move it around until I get the exact amount of width I want on either side, either centered up or if you want it a little bit skewed toward one side. At this point, I usually go ahead and string up the guitar, do the majority of the setup work, and get the nut pretty close to where I want it, and then I come back and do the final shaping, bring the width down to match the guitar. And so in order to do that, it gets a little complicated because you really have to pay attention to keeping the string centered on the fretboard. And so I came up with a little jig to help with that.
Of course.
Yeah. And what this will do,
I was just about to ask you, how do you keep it centered?
Well,
when he says he came up with a little jig to help with that, he doesn't mean a dance, okay?
And so all this does is it uses the same fence that I have on my disc sander, and it'll push the nut into the sanding surface, and you can just adjust the amount that it's going to push in there at a time, right? So you can see. Let's see if I can get that. And so I'll draw a pencil line, hack it down on the bandsaw pretty close, and then I'll just slowly, bring it in. And I can flip it around this way, and I'll slowly bring it in until, and there's a fair amount of testing going back and forth. And I'll just slowly bring it in. I'm sorry, I'm fighting on my stand. I'll slowly bring it in until the sides match. And then since I've got my nut slots at that point pretty close to the final depth, I'll just go over to the sander and I'll do the shaping. If I need to take any off the top to take any excess, I'll do that. And then I'll sand off the guitar. And I really like this vise. I don't know if any of you have this. This one's really nice because you can get the nut in here and you can sand the top and both ends at the same time, not encumbered by the edge of the vice jaws. And then I do buff. I'll buff with Jeweler's Rouge. Jeweler's white buffing compound. That way I won't stain the nut.
Jamie, is that like a jeweler's hand vise kind of a thing that you had there?
I think it's from Lee Valley.
Okay.
Can you hold it up so we can see the whole thing?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like a hand vise kind of thing.
Yeah,
it almost looks like a tiny Wilton vise.
Yeah, it does.
And you can mount it, or I just grip it in the vise when I'm using it.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of hand vices. And yes, Grace, I have 12 of them.
Got one.
That's basically it. Any questions on anything I didn't make clear?
That was wonderful, James. I'm flabbergasted at the precision that you can make a nut, and I can't imagine how quick that would become.
Yeah, it does go pretty quick. I find I spend the majority of the time on, like you were saying, how Gibson nuts sometimes have a really odd geometry on the ends.
Mm-hmm.
I'll bring the ends down until they touch whatever the highest point is, but then, it takes a fair amount of time to bring the other shapes into line.
Let me ask you how you go about dealing with like a Martin slant to the nut.
I can make a slant on the bottom with this jig, or just do it by hand. The nuts.
With that jig that you're cutting, that you just showed there, you have an insert that goes underneath. It's flat then.
Yes.
With the flat bottom. Okay.
Yeah. So I've got.
So is that when you're doing a Martin nut in that, is that like a trial and error type of thing where you just keep raising the angle until you find find the angle that fits the bottom of the slot?
Yeah, I find that I usually get pretty close, and then I'll just do it on a sanding beam by hand. Do some real fine stuff. I go back and forth between using the jigs and whichever's faster, whichever I feel like is going to get me to the end result faster.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Excellent. That's awesome.
Thank you.
We got a hand up from Steve's iPhone.
Hey James, hey everyone.
Yes. How are you?
Sorry, I came in late here. I'm just wondering, in terms of slot sizes compared to string size for each, what dimensions are you giving each slot? Say for a 10,000 string, are you making that slot 12,000, or you're matching string sizes?
I'll use the actual 10,000. I'll rough out the nut using the Ibanez style, and then when I'm coming down to do the final, I'll switch to a 10,000s.
And are you rocking that in the slot, or you just going for dead on 10?
I usually rock it a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll typically do the same thing. I will grab. I have a fairly large complement of those gauged slotting files, so I'll always go for the closest one I can get to the string that's not smaller than it.
Yeah.
But if it's one that's too far away, then I'll go for the one that's like, if I'm trying to do a 25,000 slot and I only have a choice between 24 and 28, I'll go with the 24 and rock it rather than go with the 28, because that might just mean wandering too big.
Yeah.
How much string do you guys like in your slots? Are you like all the way in, string halfway out, string barely hanging on by a thread?
I do half on the larger strings, and then I get typically the treble strings go quite a bit deeper. I mean, not buried really, really deep, but I like them to have a little more support.
Do you like to blast the back of the nut off, or do you like to angle the string? If you have like an extreme angle to the tuner, do you like to angle some of the nut slots, or do you go straight back and relieve the back of the nut slot a little bit?
I'll angle slightly and then give it a bit of a curve toward the end.
Are you talking about horizontally or vertically?
Well, you see it on some of the old Martin nuts, they'll like actually, and some Gibson ones, they'll angle.
Oh, angle the slots.
Yeah, they'll angle towards to the tuner. You see some loose recreate that. I tend to roll the back of the nuts off so extremely that it becomes a non-issue. But
yeah, I tend to roll the back of the nut by cutting a curve, outward on the inner strings. I don't bother with the outer strings, but the D and the G, I'll cut the back of the nut slot to a curve. That's a pretty easy move.
I usually go straight, and then curve the back edge, but I did, I don't know if you can see, that in the
One.
can.
You're not pinned in the other.
Yeah, see if for that I made one of those sliding.
Oh boy.
I don't use that very often, but I've shared it with some people that make fan frets guitars, and they say it really helps keeping a consistent angle of the nut for fan frets.
Do you have like a super cool way that you flip pancakes?
I
Like
have a machine.
brass, like threaded thing.
He's got a thing that comes down and claps over the pancake. So
a third arm.
Yeah, one of the reasons why I was really hoping to get out of this, for some reason, I can get G strings to like slide in a nut fine, but the D string on like Gibson's, I have hell's game every time, and I've opened slots up, opened the backs up, put big angles on the back of the nut, and they just always seem to bind up somehow. Have you got any?
I can show you. I
that?
can show you how I file it to avoid that from happening, but you'd have to pin going back to the other phone.
Because I've ended up with that it's the front edge of the nut, like that it's sharp, and I'm just wondering whether there's any kind of like rounding off at the front edge of the slot that people do.
When you say the front edge, you're talking about the fingerboard side or the
yeah, the kind of leading edge to the fingerboard. Yeah,
I don't find that my experience with the strings binds up there. If it is, then you've probably got a mismatch to the width of the slot.
The other thing too, Andy, is like your scale length is reliant on your string breaking right at the face of that nut. So if you put any kind of mustard on the ball up in there and you change where the string's actually vibrating from,
you
can mess up your intonation or make it fishy up there pretty easily.
Yeah, but how to get a D string not to bind would be
magic. If you want to quickly pin the other camera on my thing, the Dougton net, I can show you that super quickly. So let me put a guitar up here that has a nut in it. I need somewhere to put this. So if I've got, is that square on the screen?
We're looking a little obliquely, but
here we go. So if I'm here with my D string, let's say it's a 28, or let's say it's a 32. I'm always putting something down here to protect it, to protect the guitar from me. So let's say that's there. When I'm cutting the D string here, once I'm pretty much close to the height that I want to be, then my motion is this. I start with the file almost flat into the slot, so I can just bite onto the slot, and I file in small strokes round and come like that and work my way straight again. So I'm starting at an angle and I file like that, and I'm basically a half a circle so that this part of the string is relieved for that angle coming up all the way there. Because I find that they're catching at the back end of the nut, and I'm starting here and working my way up and straight at the same time. So as this deepens to the back of the slot, it's creating kind of a flute, or kind of almost like a funnel. And if I do that, I'll find that I clear up that back of that slot always enough to be able to clear that string from binding up on that edge there.
Okay, is that file that you're using there the same 32,000th file that you're using for the slot, or are you going slightly bigger size?
It's the same size. It's the same size as the slot. So if it was like, if this were a set of 12s, if I'm going 12, 16, 24, 32, I'm on a 32,000 string there, and I'm coming with the same size. So when it comes here, it just comes right into the size of the slot that's there, and it creates this almost like a funnel shape. But if you were to take a funnel and cut it in half, because I don't need to relieve this strings slot on the other side of that D string. I only need to relieve it on the part that's coming up to this part of this tuner up here. So that relieves all of that.
Exactly the same.
Spot. And it gives me just enough clearance to be able to do that. I could do it without the guard because on the D string I'm filing into the truss rod cavity anyway. But I always like to work with something between me and the guitar so I don't have to make extra work for myself. But that motion right there, it's almost flat, not completely, but just tall enough so it first bites the slot, and I bring it square.
How many strings do you do that on, Doug?
I do that on the inner strings. If I have a guitar that's really pushing the strings on the lower strings, like sometimes you get those Jacksons with like a reverse peg head where the bass strings are going over, that way, or you have strings that are coming this way on the scooped peg heads, but only on the ones that are, at an extreme angle. I find I don't really need it on the A string unless I've got a wide peg head, like a DA or something like that, where you've got a really big peg head. On the E strings, low E strings, you never need it. So that angle right there is always the goal of which ones I'm choosing, and it seems that Gibsons have a tendency to hang up a lot on the D string. There's also that condition where you can push down behind the string, and the string keeps its pitch even though you've got a freed up slot. Sometimes it's just grabbing on the back of the slot there. So that motion that way, starting here at an angle, like a 45-degree angle, and then bringing it square, gives me that relief in the back of the nut.
Yeah, I've been doing I've been doing all of that, and I still get it to.
And you're still getting it?
I don't. There must be something earlier on I'm doing fundamentally wrong, but I'll have to have a look into it.
Yes, next step, and the next question, based on that, would be: is anybody using lubricants in the nut slots? And if so, what are they using?
Generally speaking, I don't use lubricants. I will use like some what is that stuff called? Pro Cut on my files, which I guess it acts as a lubricant in and of itself anyway. So I don't feel the necessity to add a lubricant under the string.
I'll sometimes use the Big Ben's nut sauce and the little syringe.
Evan Gluck is the fan of WD-40.
Yeah, you can also shave. You can shave graphite from your pencil into the slot. I think I've done that in a pinch.
I've started using the 3-in-1 PTFE lubricant.
Oh yeah. That's
really crazy.
You can remove the pin that's there. It's there, Ian, and go back to just the speaker.
I had a question for Doug. I was wondering, aside from cutting like the kind of trumpet on the back of the nut slot on a Gibson, when you're with your nut file, are you going pretty flat along the fretboard, or are you angling it a little bit down towards the angle of the headstock?
My initial cut is always flat on the nut, and then I will roll back after. I don't like the string peaking too high at the front of the slot with a steep angle at the front of the slot, because then to me, that will always seem to wear easily if it's too much of a point that's holding the string. So I like a slot that starts off straight and then angles off to the back as it's going to relieve some of the slots ability to hug the string too much and keep it from pinging and getting grabbed in the slot. Using a good, you can avoid a lot of that stuff by keeping your files well lubricated, and the final few strokes of what you're dealing with, you're not putting any pressure down on the file. You're using the file to kind of just burnish the slot. You can always grab some of that Mitchell's abrasive cord if you want to really kind of get a slot slippery enough that if it's giving you problems grabbing a string. But I don't find that if you get to the bottom of the slot and you ease off on your file, and you generally, the last few strokes of my file are just not even having any weight on the file and just kind of working it through and just burnishing the slot a little bit at the front end, not to deepen it, but just to make sure that the bottom of my slot isn't V-shaped where it's grabbing onto the string, or too tight for the bottom of the string. And to answer Ian's question from earlier, I like probably the first E, A, D, and G strings to be pretty close to being just about half the width of the string above the slot. And then for E and B, I'll let them, I'm not worried about them sitting above the slot too much. I don't get them too deep, but certainly the diameter of the string is probably below the surface of the slot.
Thomas, you had a question? Oh, Thomas, you're muted.
Sorry. How's everyone gauging the depths of their nut slots?
While cutting the
from the pressing down the second fret and looking at the difference at the first fret, or have you got something that tells you?
My general rule of thumb for that is when I'm setting the initial slot, is, as I said before, if I'm just cutting the initial cut of the slots without strings, I cut and then I use my file as a straight edge to tell me where.
Which is that basically like pressing the first fret. You see in the gap there.
It's like pressing down a string at the second fret to see what the gap is at the first fret. And that's where I set my initial depths to before strings. Once strings are on the instrument, then I just use the feeler gauge method where I'll play a string and I'm looking for a specific height above the first fret. So with the string at rest, it's the last measurement I make. Everything's already been set up. Relief has been set up. My action's been set up. Everything's been done there. My last measurement is at the nut, where I'll play, for example, the D string. And if I want, say, a 16 thousandths above the first fret at the D string, I'll slide my 16 thousandths feeler gauge in there. If my D turns into an E flat, I'm not at 16 thousandths. I'm lower than it. If it's my D remains a D, or forgive me, that's the opposite. If my D remains a D as I've got a feeler gauge in there, that means it's still ringing above my feeler gauge. If I get to 16 thousandths, my 16 thousandths feeler gauge should turn my D into an E flat. So once I'm at E flat, if I'm measuring carefully, I get to E flat, I know I'm done, and I can go to the next string. So I usually go for, starting at about 18 thousandths on the low E, 18, and then I jump down to, 20, 18, 16, 14, and then I level out at 13, 12, and 10 for my strings to get them closer as I go to the E string. But I do it all with feeler gauges. I do the lower half of the strings from this side of the neck. I do the treble strings from this side of the neck. So if I'm looking for a G string that it's at 15 thousandths, let's say, if I put a 16 thousandths in there and it's, it turns G into G sharp, but I turn a 14 thousandths in there and it's still ringing as a G, I know I'm greater than 14 and smaller than 16. So to me, it's just a matter of just listening to where the string is as I'm measuring that gap when the string's at rest and I'm plucking it. You know, that's the way I measure it.
That's good. That's a good thing. Fellas, should we wrap it up here? James, your alarm keeps going off.
I know.
That must be telling you you got something else to do.
No, well, that's the don't forget to pick your son up from school alarm. But
And what? That's gone off 5 times now. What's going on?
I'm off the hook today. I'm off the hook today.
Parent of the year is you're gonna have like that word again.
Don't ask me why I felt like I had to set that alarm. Yeah.
Speaking of setting alarms, I want to double apologize for being tardy today. I completely lost track of time. And should we? I'd like everybody to unmute and thank Doug and James and of course Stan Earlywine. Somebody, I don't know.
Thank you guys. That was incredible.
Cheers, guys.
I feel like Doug, do you have plans to do you have any plans to do a second one of this like you did with frets, or do you think this gets there?
I mean, we could probably revisit it at some point. There's probably some stuff we left on the table. Next month, however, we're going to go run to the opposite side of the guitar, and we're going to talk about saddles and string length compensation.
What's our pun for that going to be? You want to be saddled with responsibility, or?
Well, I think I'm going to call it Blazing Saddles, and I'm going to
Blazing Saddles.
I'm going to make Dan dress up as a cowboy.
Okay, full size hat or a little party?
I want to tell 10-gallon hat for that one.
All right, guys, have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
It was awesome. As long as it's full effect.
Thank you.
Thanks, dudes. That was rad.